Hi everyone! In this lesson, we're going to sketch out ideas for an easy to print creature that we're going to make in Blender. So, while we are thinking about some kind of fun monster, I'm just going to doodle some random shapes, give him some really short legs, and maybe some really big arms. And some fingers there. And I don't even want to give him a head. I want his whole body to be his head. He's going to have some big eyes and maybe a mouth. So this crazy little creature would be difficult, but not impossible to print, since his very large arms are going to need some supports all the way around him. And I want to make this simple on purpose so that I can sculpt a design inside of Blender that is going to be easier to make. So, get back to our pencil here and think about how, if we have our main body, which has his face on it, and our feet are coming down here, we don't want a large flat area that we have to support. So we want our feet close together, and we want everything to go upwards at an angle with a flat surface on the bottom here. And we can do the same with our large arms, and we can move them down to the level of the floor so that when we are printing, our creature is going to be built entirely from the floor up. Put his fingers out there. We can give him some weird elephant toes. We can even add some details to the top of him, like some horns that go up. And all of these shapes are going up. Even if they're overhanging a little bit, they are sloping at an angle that's less than 45 degrees. So every single layer will be built on top of the layer below it. We won't have any overhangs that we need to support. So now that we have a plan for how to make a support-free weird little monster, we're going to go into Blender and start creating it using box modeling. I'm going to create a little creature figurine that should hopefully be easy to print, and we're going to do it using only a few of the available tools in Blender. If you followed along with our setup video, you should have the 3D print toolbox available. You should have your units scaled correctly so that we should have a box here in our modeling environment, and this box should be 20 millimeters across. If you use Blender for other things and you plan to set it up yourself, just make sure you set up your file here with a box that starts out 20 millimeters across. So now that we have our setup, we can use our middle mouse button to click and drag around to look around our view. I'm going to pick a side of our cube that's going to be the front of our creature here, and we're going to use a technique called box modeling. So, as should be obvious, we're starting with a box. When we have this box, we can control it in a few different ways. And I like to use the keyboard shortcuts, so I'll tell you what they are, but we're going to be able to modify things by using the tools on the side here. Right now, we have selection on, so we can drag a box or click to select things. Down here, we have the move, which gives us our little controls for move, so we can move it up and down. The rotate, which gives us a ring around which we can rotate. I'll undo that. And the scale, which gives us controls that allow us to change the size. We can also change our view up here by clicking and dragging, or by picking a side and having it snap to that side. Lastly, we have an option to turn on all of our controls at once. And you can use this, it's probably the easiest way to be able to change the size and shape of something and move it around. But this handle can get in the way. So if you don't want to see it, you can turn this off and we can use our keyboard shortcuts. We'll use G for grab. When you hit G, you're going to grab your object and move it around. You can see that it moves it around the screen, whichever direction you want, not locked to a line like when you grab one of the arrows. So if you want it to move only in one line, you'll have to pick that line. And you can see our axes, X, Y, and Z. So if you hit X, we're going to move it only in the X. If you hit Y, we're going to move it only in the Y. And if you hit Z, we're going to move it only in the Z. This is the same for all of our other keyboard shortcuts. We can tell that we're going to scale it with S. That will make it bigger or smaller. And we can choose Z or X or Y to scale it. Now, if I'm doing a move like this with my mouse, I can hit the left mouse button to accept that move and say, yes, this is how far I want it to be. Or I can click on the right mouse button and say, I don't want to do that. And it'll go right back to where it was before you started moving. So if I grab it, whoops, by accident, I can right click and it goes right back. The same can be done with R for rotate. We can rotate it according to our view, or we can hit any of our axes, and I can right click and tell it to stop. So we can move this cube around and change the size, but we can't really make very much out of it. So we're going to want to change the sides of the cube instead of the cube itself. So I'm going to go from object mode into edit mode. I can choose my modes up here, or I can hit the tab key on the keyboard and switch from object to edit mode. In edit mode, I have a bunch more controls over here, and we can see all of the points of our cube. Right next to our mode, we have our selection type. We can see a point selected here. Now if I click on something, I can select a point and G and grab it, move just that point. I'm going to right click so I don't do that. We can choose the next one, which is line or edge. And we can move an entire edge at once. And the last one is faces. And if we click on a surface here, we can move the entire surface at once. We're often going to be wanting to work with faces. So far, so good. Now I can bend and stretch and scale different parts of my box around so I can make entirely different things out of the box. But how am I going to make the limbs of my monster? So I'm going to decide that this box is going to be the central part of my monster. So I'm going to move all of it up a little bit so that I have some room for the feet. So let's take our selection. We'll hit A for all. We can look around, make sure that all of our faces are selected, and then we will move them up in Z. So I'll turn on my handles so we can see I'm just going to grab the blue one and move them up a bit. So now I have some space underneath the box. So I need to grow some shapes out of my box model here to make some legs. And I'm going to be using the extrude tool for that. But right now I only have one face. So we look at one face of the cube, we can move it around. We could change its size and rotate it, or we can extrude it, which is also E on your keyboard. The extrude tool will stay on, so everything you're going to do with extrude tool on is extrude. The next time I do it, I'm going to extrude again. You can see that it's going to make multiple new surfaces grow off of our original box. I'm going to undo these, because the trouble with the extrude tool is that all I can do is extrude until I go back here and change to this. So what I'm going to use is a keyboard shortcut again. I'm just going to hit E for extrude. But I want to make 2 legs, so I'm going to have to split this in half. So we'll go down and find our loop cut. The loop cut tool, when you turn it on, will show you where you're going to cut a loop all the way around your shape. So put your mouse over a line and it's going to make a loop around perpendicular to that line. Click on this, and now I've got a cut in the center there. So I'm going to go back to transform, and we can see that I'm selecting edges again. It's moved to edges automatically because I made some new edges and it selected them for me. This will allow me to move my loop around and even change the shape in some weird directions. So I'm going to take my 2 surfaces that I've made here. I'm going to extrude both of them. So I'll need to pick a face, and E for extrude, and I'll just send it down. We'll do the same thing on the other side, E for extrude. So I have a shape that's going to be the 2 legs of my weird creature. But I'm not going to have a flat surface on the bottom since I made these at a weird angle. So let's fix that. If I want this to be flat, I can scale it in the Z direction all the way down until it's exactly 0 in Z, which makes it exactly flat. Hard to do by moving your mouse around, but once I scale something by hitting S, I can hit Z, so I know I'm only scaling it up and down, and then I can hit 0 on the keyboard to say I want to scale it all the way down to 0. And let's click to confirm that. And we'll do the same thing with our other shape selected. In fact, I want these feet to be at the same spot. So let's go ahead and hold a shift, select my other one, and we'll do that same trick. Scale, S for scale, Z for up and down, and 0 to make them perfectly flat. Now I have a flat surface on the bottom of my legs. Great. So now I'm going to need his very large arms that are coming out the top of him, and I think I will add another loop cut around here so that the arms aren't coming right off of where the legs are. So we've seen the tool here that turns on loop cutting, but we can also, just like our other keyboard shortcuts, we can hit Control R. It's not very obvious that Control R would be loop cut, but that will allow us to cut around here, and once we click to confirm, we're done loop cutting and we're not still stuck in the tool. So now I have a loop around here, so I've got new smaller sets of faces. I'm going to go ahead and go back to faces and extrude out the shoulder of this guy. And let's stop here and rotate it in the X so that it faces somewhat downwards. Now there are tricks to make a shape perfectly symmetrical, but I don't need to make my monster perfectly symmetrical. I'm going to give him some character, slightly different arms, so I'm going to make one arm at a time. Let's hit E to extrude again, and we'll be going in the direction of the face that we just rotated. So I'll just push this all the way down through the floor. And then I'll use my scaling trick to scale for S, Z for up and down, and 0 to flatten it out. Now I've got the bottom of the hand. But clearly I didn't think this through because the bottom of the hand is lower than the bottom of the feet. So I'm going to have to raise this up. And I can use my scaling trick again. I can also line this up in Z to where our feet are. So if I click on this shape here, I can see that in the transforms box here, if you don't have this open, you can hit N or this little tiny arrow on the side. I can see that the distance here is negative 16.12 millimeters. Well, let's put this to a round number so it's easier to type, and we'll say right now you're negative 16. Now I'll click on this shape and we'll make it the same. Negative 16. This guy is also negative 16. Now all of my shapes are the exact same height. I'm just going to move this arm in. And let's do the same on the other side. So here we go with an E for extrude. We're going to rotate it here in the X. Maybe move it down a little. Extrude again. And then we're going to use our scale Z 0. And lastly, we want to change its height to make sure that it's negative 16 like the rest of them. And all of our surfaces are flat on the ground. I'll move it in here. So now he has two wonky looking arms, and we're going to put a face on the front of him. So we've used this box to make ourselves a very rough representation of our creature. But we wanted this creature to be sort of round, have some interesting details on him, some kind of a face. And doing that, we're going to use the subdivision modifier. So using box modeling is great as long as we have a small amount of surfaces and points to move around. If I made a very detailed shape and I wanted to move each and every surface around just like I did here, it would take us a long time to build a model. In this way, I'm going to build a very simple model and then have the computer add detail to it. So let's click on our modifiers tab, which is this little wrench right here. We're going to click on add a modifier, and we're going to go to generate this column all the way down to subdivision surface. Now immediately we are going to see a rounded out version of our creature, and the box that we are using as our model is floating around it. So we don't need to edit any of the faces inside of our rounded version, we only are editing our outside model. And since it rounds everything off, well, not very round yet, you can see that in the viewport it says 1 subdivision. So we have broken each face down 1 time. So if we turn this up, we're going to break it down multiple times. Turn it up to 3, turn it up to 4. Everything is looking really, really smooth. Now, if your computer is having a hard time with this, you can keep our render down pretty low, or our viewport here, and then we can turn it up before we export for 3D printing. So we can get the most detail out of it before we print, but while we're working with it, we can just look at it in, let's say, viewport quality 2 or 3. I think I'll keep it at 3. It looks like my computer's fast enough to handle that. So now, if I move this shape around, you can see that our subdivision surface is following the shape that we have created. I'm going to put his arms forward. So keep in mind, even though I can see through this, I'm clicking on the surface that is closest to me. I don't want to move this part of the arm. I want to move the underside here. So I'll move these forward. And let's say we move our legs back a little bit. Just a little. All right. Now we need to start adding details to this crazy shape. And for that, we can use our loop cut technique. So I'm going to use Control R and put a loop around this arm. When I use Control R to do it, we can see that I can still slide this thing after I click once, and it won't be attached in position until I click again. If I go all the way down to the bottom and click here, with two lines very close to each other, let me turn off my widget here so we can see this better. I'll use my mouse scroll wheel to zoom in. You can also zoom in and out by holding down Control and using your middle mouse button. This has caused the bottom surface to become flat. So let's use the same trick to make all of the bottom surfaces of our limbs flat. Control R. We'll put a new loop down very close, right on the bottom. Control R and loop all the way down. All right. Oops. Zoom out a little bit. So now we have limbs that sit on the ground, but our creature is looking more like a messed up letter M than a creature. Definitely is going to need a face. So let's give it some eyes. We're going to use these shapes that we already have here as the basis for our eyes. So let's choose face, select this shape and hit E for extrude. You can see we can stick out an entire object here or push it in, but I don't want the eye to be quite that big. So instead of clicking somewhere to create an extrusion, I'm going to type S for scale. Now I'm going to scale this down to the size I want the eye to be. So we can see that we've made several more faces here. These are connecting to the faces next to it, and the central one is the extruded face from before. Let's do the same trick on the other side. Let's make a different eye here. Extrude. E and S for scale. Scale it down until we have about the size that we want the eye to be. I give them two different sized eyes. That seems fine. We'll hold down Shift and select our other eye, and then we're going to hit E to extrude them both at the same time. I don't think I like his eyes bulging out. I'm going to sink them in to his head. And now that I've clicked, I have these holes sunken into his head so he looks like he has eyes. I can keep on modifying my shapes as much as I want to try to get the detail of the subdivision surface to look right. So because I have these two shapes selected already, I could hit E to extrude again. I could stick this back out in this direction. We'll have some eyes in his eye sockets. Now his limbs just kind of grow right out of his body, and they don't look very separate. He's got no knees and no elbows. So let's use some loop cuts again to make these things a little more defined. So I'll Control R, loop cut, and see what happens if I slide it in close. It's going to tighten up that edge there, but I think I'm going to want to get it close and then hit S to scale it in. So now our connection to the body is a little smaller than the width of the body itself. And we have the same thing going on with our elbow shape here. I'm going to hit Control R, make another loop, get it close to the elbow. But I can see that if I do this, I'm going to end up with a shelf under here. That's not very good for printing. So let's make the elbow a little bit closer. So let's go here, and we'll scale to shrink it in a little bit so he has a little bit of shape to his elbow. And then I want to grab the entire elbow and move it in so that his arm is a little bit more curved and not so much a shelf here. So if I want to grab all of the lines in a loop around here, I could hold down Shift and select more of them. But if I have a lot to select, I can also hold down Alt, and it's going to select everything that goes around in a loop. This might not always work because you have a line here that comes from a corner to another corner, and the computer might have a hard time figuring out exactly which part of this is a loop all the way around. But for a shape that goes all the way around, it's pretty easy. Now we can use our movement tool here, or G for grab. We can move the entire elbow in at once. Now the whole thing has a pretty smooth angle to it. And I think I want to make this a little less wide. So I'm going to use this thing to shrink it in just the X direction. That way, his elbow gets a little smaller, and then it gets wider again at his hand. Now we got to do the same thing with our other limbs. So let's go ahead and add our loop cuts. Control R. There we go. Get it close. Scale it in. Control R. Get it close. S for scale. Hold down Shift and Alt to select our other parts of our elbow. And we'll move them down in a bit. Then we'll go ahead and shrink the elbow in X. So this is looking a little more like an arm. We'll do the same sort of thing with our legs to separate them from the body. We're going to hit Control R. Get a loop up here, very close. Scale it in. R. Loop. Scale. All right. And maybe give him some knees. Control R. Keep this one right in the middle. And let's move his knee forward a little bit. Control R. In the middle. And move his knee forward a little bit. I think I like how his lower legs look. It's kind of an interesting shape. They're so long. But I want his upper arms to be really, really wide. So let's make the bottom of them wider. Let's go ahead and select all of the lines on the bottom by dragging a box around them. Stretch them out. Oops. Because I have lines on top of lines, looks like we're only stretching one of them out at a time. So let's go ahead and undo that. Let's make sure that we can select all of our lines at once. So we're going to turn off our shaded mode and click on this last one for X-ray. It can be very hard with a complicated shape to see what's going on in the X-ray, but if I drag a box to select, you can see that I can select everything and nothing is blocked. So let's move this in. Well, let's turn back on our shaded mode to see what it looks like. I think that's cool. He's got a big flat surface on his hand there. Let's do the same here. Oh, it looks like my loop cut didn't go quite as close to the bottom as I intended. That's okay. I can select all of these edges I can scale them up and move them in a little bit. We'll go back to our shaded mode. Let's zoom out a little bit. And our monster's almost done. At this point, you can spend more time adding other things to it. We can select our top here and possibly create some weird horns, as long as they don't overhang too much. Scale this in, extrude it some more, scale it in. And we can try and add some details with even more loop cuts. You could add toes or fingers to him, but I won't spend too much time on him since we are going to make him ready to print. Make sure that if you add a lot of things, you don't add shapes that stick straight out of one side and don't have anything supporting their overhangs. As long as everything is going up at an angle, this guy will be easy to print without any supports. Next time, I'll be showing you how we take this out of Blender and into Cura. We are going to take our finished monster design and we're going to export it for printing. Here in object mode, we can't see our box that controls the shape of our subdivision surface here. But we can see any changes that we make to our modifiers. So before we get ready to export, let's make sure that this guy looks as smooth as we want him to. So we can go ahead and try raising up the number of subdivisions in here. We can get a very, very smooth looking shape. And if we zoom in really close, we can see that it's become made of a ton of tiny, tiny triangles. Now, this might not be necessary, especially because he's going to be printed pretty small. So all of that extra detail in the smoothness is not really going to be necessary. It just makes the file more complicated. I'm going to put my viewport down to 4. While I can see the lines in here, when we do a final print, it's not going to be visible. So let's double check that our scale is at 1 and that our dimensions are something that we are ready to print. So we can see that in X, he's 30 millimeters across. His widest dimension is 71 across in Y. So as long as this will fit in the printer, then we are ready to print. So we're going to click on the 3D Print tab. Now, when you save your file here in Blender, you're going to end up with a .blend file. If we export it from our 3D print, we're going to create a format that is more usable for 3D print files. So we're going to pick STL, which is the default, is the most common file that's used by most printers. Now I'm going to check Apply Scale on here, because I want it to remember to do that if I have forgotten. We only have one shape in here, so we have to have it selected. And right now, it's still named Cube. So if I make a complicated scene with a lot of shapes in it, it's going to be hard if they're all just called Cube 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'd like to go into my cube and rename it. And we're going to call this cube Monster. So now outside of my Object tab, which is the square with the corners around it, I'm going to go back to my modifiers. And we're going to see exactly where we're going to export our file to. So if I click on my file folder here, we can see that it's going to a default location, my hard drive. We want to put it in a place where we know it'll be easy to find. I want to put it in my downloads for right now and hit accept. So I'm going to export this to my downloads. I'm going to apply the scale and I'm going to make it an STL. We don't have to worry about copy textures because our design doesn't have any textures. So we're going to click on export. It'll say right down here that it has successfully exported. And then we're going to head over to Cura and double check that we've got our model correct. So in our slicer program here, we're going to open up Untitled Monster. Now it's called Untitled because I didn't name my blend file. So if you name your blend file Monster and then you name your cube Monster, it's going to give you an STL called Monster Monster. Now that I've got my monster here in my print platform, I can see that my flat surfaces on the floor are working, but at low quality, it's got a lot of red marks that are telling me that it has overhangs. These slopes are a little too shallow, according to Cura. I think this print will probably still work, but because he's all very smooth shapes, we're going to want to increase the quality at least to standard, and possibly more. So if we head to our support settings, we're going to turn them off for now, slice this and see what it looks like. So let's click on our preview, and let's head down to the first layer. You can see that we are going to have our first layer attached to the floor pretty well. And we're going to be growing up our legs and arms, no problem. Here is the first part where we encounter a bridge. Let's go up a layer, and let's look at this. Right now, we have this space between the legs where we're going to draw a shape that doesn't have anything underneath it. So it looks like I should have made the legs closer together if I wanted to print this without supports, because otherwise we're going to have a little bit of an area here that might end up rough or sagging. Let's keep going up, and we can see that the arm is starting to lean over to grow up to attach to the body. But each successive layer of the arm doesn't really overlap the last layer. It's still going to be sticking to the layer below it. So our slope here for this arm looks good. This arm might be a little bit more steep, but if we zoom really close in, we can still see that each layer is being built on top of the layer before it. So we shouldn't have any real problems with that. Our eyes have some very interesting curves to them, but as we go over the top of them, we have maybe the shortest of bridges, and our horns go straight up, so we don't have to worry about them. So aside from the legs of the monster, I think that everything looks like it's working here without supports. I can add supports to the underside of this guy, or I can see how well it works without them. Or I can go back into Blender and move his legs closer together so that we have a smoother curve here, just like we have underneath the arms. Once I have decided that it is ready to print, I'm going to save this G-code to the disk. And now let's it's ready to send to our printer. See you next time.